So given that I'm outcome driven, I'm just going to leave because you've clapped, right? So the first thing is, how many of you guys are actually working on Agile projects today? Can you raise your hands, ladies and gents? Some. How many of you have an awareness of Agile, of what Agile is? If I asked all of you what your versions were, how many of you would have the same opinion? And there lies challenge one. Just to set the scene a little bit, also, I mean, I come from Skype. I want you to sort of guess how many people we have in Skype, approximately. Because when I joined just over a year and a half ago, I walked in, and I'm just curious to share the first part of my day with you. How many people do you think work at Skype? Put your hand up if you think it's 200. Put your hand up if you think it's more than 200. Put your hand up if you think it's less than 200. It's an interesting, okay. Right, well, it's more than 200. Put your hand up if you think it's more than 1,000. Put your hand up if you think it's less than 1,000. Right, I could keep going, by the way. Now, anybody who fires up Skype, the first thing you think is, really? It takes that many people? And then you think about the number of platforms we have to deploy to. Think about all the devices it has to run on. When you fire up that application, you just take it for granted, in the same way as you take your television for granted when you just switch on the TV and magic happens. It's that magic box. Well, behind that magic box, we have a lot of people making that magic box work on many platforms. So I turn up thinking, really? Skype needs Agile at scale? Really? And then you turn up and you're thinking, holy cow, this is big, right? It's like somebody's lifted away the curtain. And then I start to think about, okay, so I start to reflect a little bit, and then you go through your books and you think, do we have to go back to first principles? Skype, when I arrived, was actually doing Scrum everywhere. Who's heard of Scrum? Okay, most people have heard of Scrum. Who hasn't heard of Scrum? Wow, they're doing a great job with their marketing. So we were doing Scrum, and we were doing it pretty much everywhere. Now, when I say we're doing Scrum, there's lots of ways of doing Scrum. Okay. And how many of you are doing Scrum on your projects right now? And many of you are probably doing Scrum, right? So we've got lots of teams doing Scrum. So the first thing I thought was, okay, let me just rewind, because I come from an organization where Scrum was one of the options. So I start to open my books again. You go back and you think, oh, I can't turn up there looking like an idiot, as though I don't know everything there is to know about Scrum. I'm the head of Agile for Scrum, and everything to do with Agile at Skype. And also I'm working with some of the smartest minds on the planet. They've hired in some of the best guys in the world who know about Agile. And I'll be thanking them later. So I worked with some of those guys. So you're thinking, and I'm supposed to be, in quotes, their manager, right? So I've turned up. We've got the contract team in of some of the brightest and best in Agile in the world, and I'm being given the role of their manager. So I open the books, and I imagine I'm an alien, right? You imagine you're an alien and you're reading a book about Agile. You've opened your first book, you read it. Probably you're in this situation, right? How many of you are currently reading a book about Agile? Okay. All right, I've read lots, as most people have. And you read it, and the first thing you see is the world is the perfect sphere. It's like the perfect project. It leads you down this track of thinking, wow, I just want to go and try it. This is awesome. I can see how this would have solved all the problems I've ever imagined. And you're just so excited that you just want to give it a go. And when you read it, you think, hold on a minute, are there any managers in here? And you start reading through it, and you're going, yep, you've seen the no managers thing? Who's seen hashtag no managers? Who's following anything to do with hashtag no managers? You probably want to have a look, because they're trying to get rid of us. I'd suggest. So search for hashtag no managers. Go on Twitter. I'm not saying they're the enemy. I'm saying there's a huge groundswell of thinking around the fact you don't need managers. So there's no mention of managers. So what you see when you read the books is you'd imagine if somebody asked you to draw an org chart, you draw an org chart that looked like this. And what's wrong with that? No PMs. But work just gets done, doesn't it? Doesn't work. Don't these teams just make magic happen? How many of you are working in a project where there's more than one team? Good luck. Right? Because we've got nothing else to say to you. And of course, when you do work across teams, all the teams work well together. Read the books, right? They all love each other. I love you, you love me, you know. We all just get on perfectly. I don't know whether you live in that world. I'm back to this perfect sphere, right? It's the world of the perfect sphere. And if you go on the number of times I used to turn up at conferences, I don't get it as much now because I try not to get out as much. When I used to work for IBM, I'd turn up at the conferences, and the number of people, you turn up at a conference and you go, would somebody just explain to me how this kind of happens at the size of 25,000 people in the IBM labs? And they go, and I'd say, so we're trying to do it this way, and they go, oh, you're just stupid, you don't understand. And you'd look around going, well, who's trying to do it with that many people? And then they'd all go, anyway, let's go and talk about user stories and story points. Nobody's got anything to say. Then you come across this little dilemma, right? This is my favourite one. This is one of my favourites. So, how many of you are PMs with Scrum Masters on your project? How many of you are the Scrum Master? We'll have a little conversation later about whether that's a good or a bad idea. So this is one of the things you often see. And then you also, oh, and of course, I didn't put the third one on, which is the real manager of the people trying to do the work. So how many of you work in this cross-functional, interesting liquid pool that we all go for now? Okay. Staff liquidity. Why wouldn't we want to move everybody around? Well, that's another interesting dynamic. So then you have this going on at scales. Let's talk about the challenges you guys start to face at scale. You come across this. The intersection of this is where risk goes exponential in large projects, right? The first thing is you've got culture. You have all these organizational cultures. How many are working on outsource? Good luck. Has Agile got much to say about that? Well, there's certain people who have, but you hit this cultural gap in the middle. Then you have complexity. Then you have this intersection of the market, your organization, and suppliers. How do you manage the complexity with the many moving parts? How many of you think you just run a scrum of scrums with this with this? Just get a scrum of scrums. Get everybody to go all to the middle, go to the gambler, go to there, and it'll all be great. So again, that's where risk appears. And then, how many of you work on projects where there's some new technology? Good luck. Now, one of the things you'd like to do is you'd like to say, well, you know what? We don't need new technology. How many times have you sitting there thinking, oh, I'm going to think about this risk of taking this new technology? And then somebody says, you do realise the old stuff's being decommissioned. And you're thinking, oh, okay, line through taking that off my list. So given the fact so you've got this other little risk piece here. How many of you have got all three going on? You've got outsource, you've got new technology, you've got cultural differences, you've got global teams. How many of you work with global teams? Good luck. Right? It's the classic YouTube conference call sketch, right? I don't know, everybody seen that? You know, it's like they spend 25 minutes getting on the call, and by the end of it, nobody said anything, and then they're all got to go to another meeting. Right. So again, by the way, you could use Skype for that. That gets me my bonus this quarter. How many of you use Skype for that? Some of you obviously can't say you can because probably corporate policy dictates you must use the internal video conferencing solution that never really fires up very well, but, you know, you end up having to. But anyway, so when you look at all those different risks that you could manage, how many of you think about the fact that when you're managing a project, you're managing a risk profile, a probability curve? Do you want to raise your hands? How many are thinking about probability curves? Most of us haven't even been taught this, by the way. Most of us, we go on the PMI courses. We might, if we're lucky, some of us bump into this. Some of us go on a Prince 2 course and they don't talk about some of this. As soon as you think about it, if you've done probability, you suddenly realise, hold on a minute, this is kind of about risk, and risk has a probability curve of occurring. So here you'll see, by the way, the dotted line is your most likely chance of success. And look at the areas underneath both of those curves, and that tells you where you're probably going to end up. You're probably going to end... Who thinks you're more likely to end up in A? Which is you'll finish before before that dotted line. How many people think you'll end up in B? Yeah, that's what that graph is showing. That graph says the probability is, because the area under the curve is greater, you're more likely to end up in B than A. Why is that? How many of you have driven to an airport? Caught a flight. There's a guy called Troy McGuinness, who was one of the team I worked with, who told me this, and it's one of the stories I always remember. And he's a great guy who draws these kind of curves all day long about probability. Did a lot of work with some organisations around many of the statistical ways we can look at projects. How many of you have driven to an airport again? How many have caught a flight? How many have missed a flight? Okay. How many think there are more ways to be early than late to an airport? Why is that? Because there's many things that are going, there's many moving parts. There's a lot of complexity between you getting to the airport and you getting that flight. So there's only normally one optimum way. So one of the things we try and do is we try and you'll hear, again, those of you who get the opportunity later, there's a guy in the room called Chris Matz who worked with me, a guy at the back here, talks about risk. Do you want to stand up a minute, Chris? So Chris is the other guy who was working with me. So Chris does a lot about real options, about actually when should you exercise the option along this probability curve. So Chris, I'm not going to go into that in detail. Chris is the leading expert on this, so he'll cover that. But the key thing is you're measuring a probability curve. You're measuring a risk profile. Your job as project managers is your job, though, put your hand up if you think your job is to make that wider. Is your job to make that wider, or is your job to put your hand up if you think it's to narrow that probability curve? Anybody? Your job is to narrow that curve. How do you narrow that curve? You do that by taking away risk. Because what makes that the shape it is, the reason it's this shape is the more risks you have, it basically puts spikes in that chart towards the later part of that line. So everything that occurs that means you're going to be later. So let's, for example, say, who's had hardware delayed? Oh, yes! See? Hardware. So if you had hardware delayed, that would cause, if I drew a normal curve, it would show a spike after the dotted line to say, that's going to cause a delay. Who has had somebody critical to the project go off ill? Right. So that's another spike you'd see off the far right. So you can see that the more risks you have occurring, the more likely you are to end up in that B section than you are in the A section. What Agile does is it gives us a mirror to be able to think about those risks. Because if you read the literature, who's read the Scrum Guide? Who's a CSM, Certified Scrum Master? How many times did you see the word risk in the Scrum Guide? Anybody? How many people heard the word impediment? How many people have heard of the word impediment in Agile? So I turn up in the Agile world as a PM before, and I go, okay, so back to my alien reading the book on Agile, and I go, oh, that's funny. They don't even mention risk in here. Oh, how strange. Maybe I just get my risk list and hashtag no risk list. Right. Goodbye. All my problems solved. I'm just going to iterate. Of course, then you realise that you are going to need something, especially when you scale, back to the point that was made earlier, right? So when you start to scale, you start to realise the team has things that it needs to manage outside of just iterating. And I had a really interesting conversation with one of the thought leaders on Agile, where he and I got in a room together, and I'd just taken on a new role. And we'd hired him to come in and give me some support. And I basically said, so, John, I don't see risk lists mentioned anywhere in all the literature, and yet at the scale we're at, I think risks are pretty important. Having a risk list feels like we should be telling the team we should have risk lists. No, we don't need risk lists. We have impediments, and we have iterations to manage the impediments. And I said, but surely impediments are risks that have occurred? And he just looked at me, furrowed brow, and went, oh. Well, it doesn't say you can't have a risk list in Agile. So that's my model, right? So now I've worked out that in Agile, where it doesn't say you can't do something, you're a thought leader to create that, right? You've done some thought leadership. But coming back to the mirror, how many of you are using Agile again? How many of those who are using Agile say it doesn't work? Somebody's being really honest. Well done. So I turn up in one part of an organisation in my previous org and in this one, and you turn up and you go, so, how's Agile going for you? It sucks. This sucks. This is the worst thing ever. Well, why does it? No, this Agile stuff, we just need to get back to the old way of doing it. And why does it suck? Well, it keeps telling us again and again and again that we're not delivering the right things. So that sucks, right? Well, yes, that's Agile working. Yeah. So the thing is with Agile, what you'll see, especially when you go back to risks, when you look at your risk list, how many of you run a risk list? How many of you looked at it in the last week? Oh, when I say don't put your hands up. I love the organisations where, I won't even ask you this question, but I love the organisations where you have the template risk list. And you're going, yeah, have you got a risk list? Oh, yes, I've got a risk list. Is it a good one? I think so. Somebody else made it before me. Did they succeed? No idea, they've left. But what Agile is going to do is it's going to give you a mirror. And how many of you are getting that? How many of you are using the feedback that Agile is giving you? Yeah? How many of you deliver something of value at the end of each of your iterations? And what I mean of value is, by the way, is not a document. So how many of you are working with, at the team level, even at the team level, are they delivering things that you would say you could run and execute and are adding value in some way? That's what the mirror is showing you. And then you start to think about the risks that are preventing that. So you should, one of the takeaways from today is get the risk list out, keep it running. But your job as a PM is not to tell the teams how to address those risks. It's not what we do in Agile. Those teams have some level of empowerment. If you hired them and they're stupid, fire them. You've hired them because they are good at what they do, and you'd hope they're good at thinking about the risks that could hurt you. So you need to think about setting guardrails. Set the guardrails for the team. So we spend a lot of time in Skype thinking about when we work with the teams, and Chris and Marina at the back there were very instrumental in helping do this, and the thinking around this is we went to the managers and we said, guys, the PMs, etc., the managers, and we said, you can't just go in and tell teams what to do because you're not the smartest person in the room. Shock horror. I know that's hard, but it's true. And at scale, that's never going to work, right? You are not going to know everything. So when it comes at the team level, each individual team, the best you can do is to have them work with you on A, creating a risk list, and B, managing those risks for you, because the Agile Mirror will show you every 2 weeks whether it's succeeding or failing. So how long are you going to trust them for? 2 weeks. Is that better than it was before? Yes, because I used to trust them for 6 months, and my risk list didn't help me. So an example here is that we use in Skype is the lottery count. Some people call it the bus count. I prefer the lottery count. It sounds more positive, which is, say to the team, how many people would have to win the lottery for us not to function? I want you to manage that risk. How, as a team, challenge them? How are you going to manage the risk of the lottery count? The Agile Mirror will tell us whether we're going to do the right thing. Will tell us every so many weeks, we challenge them and say, have you fixed that problem? Has the bus count got better or worse? One of the things we often say in Agile, and it's one of my mantras, is I don't want to know whether it's good or bad. I'm really not interested. All I care about is it getting better or is it getting worse? That's why anybody who's looking at snapshot data points needs their head read. Telling you nothing. Look at a trend. A trend will tell you a lot more. It'll tell you whether things are getting better or worse. Same with risk lists. Who uses the concept of a risk radar? Okay, I'll talk more about those later. So this is one of the things that, again, Chris and Marina have been helping set up in Skype, is what we have here is we have components across the top. This is the way a team could solve this, by the way. So if they're struggling going, oh, I don't understand what you mean, I've got no idea what you're talking about, you can say, okay, well, here's a way of doing it, right? Here's a set of components that we actually have to build or we actually maintain. Here's the names of one of my teams. Grade yourselves. Well, let me say that again. Grade yourselves on how much you know about the various components. Wow, that sounds like there might need to be trust. What, I'm going to have to own up, say I don't know everything about everything? There's problem number one, right? Yeah, okay. Let them grade themselves. There's the Agile Mirror will tell us whether we're going in the right direction or not. So as people start to grade each other, they can pair up. Oh, you're a 3. Let me sit down with you for a while. I'm a 3. Wouldn't it be great if we could understand any gaps we have with each other? You're not really a 3. Let's move you to a 3. So you can go back to the chart and add your 3. So looking at this one, here's a test. You didn't think you were going to be tested. Which of the components along here would you want them to focus on pairing with most at the team level? Put your hand up if it's T. W? Z. Yep, it's Z. Why? Because you've only got one. If Chris wins the lottery, what's going to happen to that probability curve? Is it going to the left or the right? And you know what? When you get to the end of a sprint, get them to fill it in again. How much do you know, guys? Right. And the other thing here is Chris, Jane, Raj, and Tim. If you really want to be completely mean, you could go to their managers and say, you know what? I know they want a promotion. I know they want to move teams. But until they're a 3 in this, until they've trained up a couple of people who are 1s or 0s to a 2, maybe we don't encourage them to move. Okay. Let's talk about outside the team at scale, a bit more of a scale risk that you can look at. So your jobs as managers, as PMs at this point, is to start to think about a risk radar. Let me start. So I was taught by a guy, this comes from some of the work I did with some of the military. I actually worked on some of the RAF stuff with a couple of guys who worked on heads-up displays for Harrier jump jets. That's an interesting part of the world to operate in. So when oddly enough, they use the risk radar kinds of thinking. Am I going to attack the things that are further away or closest is the way to think about things. So what's going to attack me soonest? And the size of the dot will also have a view on which ones I'm going to tackle. So you can start to plot your risks in this way. And also, and you can look at all the dependencies you have. Who here has to manage dependencies? Well, shame on you. The Agile books don't talk about managing dependencies. What are you doing wrong? No, but seriously. The thing you then need to do as a project manager, your job, you set the team the constraints to manage the risks that you identify with them for them. Set them the constraints. Think about what Agile will give you to say whether they're meeting those constraints. Who here has had performance problems on the project they've run? When they've run it, it's like, holy cow. Really? It runs this slow? Well, it's not slow on my machine, says the developer. How many times have we heard that, right? Well, how can you... So in the team level, you can say, guys, I never want to hear this sucks on live, right? So set the team the objective of fixing that in the team. This kind of stuff, where you have large-scale integration, your job as a PM is to manage those risks. That's where you focus your time. That's where you are proactive. That's where you spend your effort with Agile in an Agile organisation, because the team can't fix all those other things. You remember I put all those circles up earlier? That intersection of all those places is where your time is spent. Anybody spending more than a few moments looking at their project plan rather than spending time in those grey shaded areas is doing the wrong thing. Because the only way to make that project plan actually turn into something that anybody really cares about is to focus on those grey areas. Because the team can't. Your job is to go out and do all that work. So what does the Agile Mirror, how does the Agile Mirror help us? Well, the first thing it says is you can go to other teams and say, you know what, other dependencies, and say, I'm not taking that big delivery from you anymore. I'm done. Because every time you give me a huge dollop of stuff, we then have to A, integrate all of it and test all of it. And that means, where does my probability curve go? Left or right with all that huge, great big integration from other teams? Left or right? Does it go this way or that way? It's going to make things worse, right? So what I do as a manager, my role is to go to the teams and go, I'm not taking that anymore. I need you to give me smaller batches. I want smaller... Now, does that sound counterintuitive? Hold on a minute, if I'm getting smaller batches, don't I have to do more work to integrate it more frequently? Yes, you do. But you know what? It's less work than having to manage that risk profile going that way at the end. Because you're getting regular drops from other teams. So your job is to encourage all those kinds of things. What other ways can the Agile Mirror help us to do? Because you'll know at the end of each iteration then, every 2 weeks or so, you will get feedback. Could we integrate that latest drop? Yes or no from those other places? No, it sucked. Go back to supplier, ask more questions. The other thing is as well is how many, those dealing with outsource. One of the things you often see with outsource is even when you get them to deliver drops, so many people miss the classic trick of asking them for the test harnesses. Duh. So many suppliers I've heard go, yes, of course we do Agile. We can give you 2 weekly drops. And then you go, I'd love to see your test harnesses. Can you give me those that you run? And they go, anyway, let's talk about the contract. So I asked for the test harnesses. If they're doing Agile, they should be testing everything they're doing for you, and they should be able to give you all the test harnesses that they're using before they give you that wonderful golden ball of perfect sphere. So how can the Agile Mirror help us at the organisational level, at the program level with Agile? Well, the first thing you can start to do is you can plan using risk. You can work with the organisation and say, here's my risk list. I've got these 3 risks. Here's the user stories that we're going to have to deliver across here. If I build these user stories, the ones with the crosses will mean I've addressed that risk. So I can work with the teams and say, with all my dependencies, with all the teams building the various things I'm waiting for to be delivered, as the project manager, and say, these are the ones, which story would you build first? Would you want to build first as a project manager? Given the fact you want to move the curved chart I showed earlier, you want to move everything this way. Which one would you get them to focus on first? Story 3, right? So again, you can go to your dependencies and start to get them to say, here's the user stories I need, here's the risks I have, I need you to deliver this. The teams can't do that. The teams have no power to work out how other people deliver into them. What they can do is they can use things like this to understand where their risks and dependencies are, and then you can then make sure that you ask for those things in that order. Now, the other thing that will do this again is you can go back to teams and say, wouldn't it be really great if we did the most risky things that added the most value that took us the shortest time? There's an interesting idea. So you can start to challenge and say, that's when we get the real value. Anybody thinks, you only get the real value when it's into the customer's hands. So one of the things we kind of talk about is it's the time to first telemetry. The time you get the first measurement coming back that says, I'm doing the right thing. So at the program level, or the big project level with many teams, one of the things you'll find is, again, set the challenge to the organisation. How are we going to measure whether what we've delivered is actually what is required? Using measurement, not opinion. So one of the things you'll find is, how do we instrument the application to be able to give us that feedback? Yeah? Conscious of time. Machine is dying. So the other thing to think about at the large scale is, this is one of those brain teasers where you go, oh. So what we're trying to, in the small with agile teams, the idea is we're actually trying to remove the need for testers. Because what we do is we want to build quality in from the start. It's never going to happen, but that's what we aspire to. So anybody, for example, who thinks, read the Agile books again, right? You as project managers, you read the Agile book, you go, oh, dev and test are the same people. Right, let's get all those testers in a room and fire them, because that will cut my budget. And then hopefully common sense kicks in, and you go, but hold on a minute, I'm delivering this end-to-end thing with 18 teams that needs to integrate. So I'm going to kind of keep them, thank you very much, and I'll write my own Agile book. So the idea here is, managers is to organisations as testers is to teams means it's aspirational. The idea is you should teach the organisation not to need you, knowing that likelihood of happening is never going to happen. In most organisations, because of all those circles with the overlapping grey, that the teams will really struggle to manage because of lots of cultural issues, lots of lack of trust, lots of new technologies coming in that teams can't handle on their own very successfully. Yes, you'll hear the success stories like Semco and Zappo, and Skype does pretty well, but we still have managers. But you should aspire to think about, how do I use risk? How do I use risk at the team level? To give them the opportunity to fix the risk. You never tell them what to do in terms of fixing the risks. You can give them ideas. You set the constraint. My machine power's just died. Note to self, plug in. You set the constraint. With the large organisation, You manage all those grey areas with a risk list, and then you think about how does Agile, if I deliver frequently, how do I use things like small batch sizes? How do I use things like continuous delivery? How do I use things like continuous instrumentation and feedback loops? How do I use risk list and the Agile practices I'm learning to make sure that the organisation is delivering to me? So that's the key thing about when you look at risks is you look down into the teams, you set the constraints. You lose up to the organisation, you actively address those risks. That is your job. Set the constraints, actively manage risks. Remember the curve. Thank you very much.